Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 2 preview. We're looking at a lot of the big talking points coming out of Game Week 1 and now looking ahead towards Game Week 2 and beyond. Whether there are any sort of hot topics we need to react to in terms of transfers to maybe look at, how we responded towards teams and their performances and how those are constantly changing. But equally, it's also a good time to almost reassess the long-term strategy piece as well. I'd also like to mention that at this moment in time, you can still use Fantasy Football Hub to actually have a look at getting your draft rater right now. You can also use it to get suggested transfers that are niche and focused for your team to actually help you support, especially if you have had a pretty poor start. For example, I'm in the position right now of being 3.8 million in the world. I'm pretty happy with my team as it stands, but still open to ideas, still open to transfers that can kind of support my team. Starting with the first topic of this week in terms of the preview, I wanted to discuss Reijnders. Then actually I wanted to discuss Salah and the premiums blanking and also Salah versus Haaland as a part of that topic. As far as the third topic, it's the data recap of the week. So almost looking at the performances from the team perspective, how they performed against the expectations that we had, and then also a preview for next week as well from a data perspective, as well as captaincy. So starting with the first topic, which is going to be Reijnders, he had an exceptional performance, right? I think if you go on any social media platform, you look at punditry, everyone was waxing lyrical about him. And to be fair, he's a midfielder at the end of the day. This is not someone who we're expecting to have absolutely insane numbers, but he's a 5.5 midfielder now who actually seems like he's going to be a core part of the Pep team. Pep's already mentioned within his post-match press conference that he plans to actually have the club escort a few players out because they just simply have way too much depth. And when you watch the game versus Wolves, I think it's abundantly clear how important Reijnders is. And then I think you can almost go two ways with this argument, right? For the people who don't own Reijnders, I think it's quite easy to say that the fixtures are quite poor for City. But then also I've seen sort of the opposite view, which is that he's an essential pick. I personally don't think he is an essential pick, but I think what Reijnders almost presents is he does feel like a bit of a no-brainer pick. And what's the positive of this? I think if you were shopping, for example, in the 5.5 tier and you have someone like Malin who you're not happy with, or you've like myself, for example, shopped in the 6.0 tier, and you now see an asset that's a little bit cheaper that can actually pocket you a little bit of funds for the future, there is still an opportunity to make the move towards someone like Reijnders if you have the confidence in his minutes. I tend to think that his minutes will be really strong. I'm not suggesting that he's going to play, a dual 8, play as a 10 potentially over both Marmoush and Cherki consistently. There's going to be games where he's maybe even playing a holding role over Nico. So my thing is, I think his minutes are really strong, and the overall production that he does possess, being a 90-minute player for Man City, and with the sort of historic numbers that he's had now for that last season AC Milan, I feel quite comfortable saying that he's a very, very strong pick, right? I'm not saying he's going to shoot up to, let's say, 0.3 XG per game. No, I'm just saying if he kind of maintains this sort of profile of being a 0.2 XG per 90, a 0.15, and actually maintains his minutes and plays for Man City, you could actually expect that he could maybe overshoot that a little bit in the short term, because I can see that the markets have already reacted to some of his performances and almost predicted an additional element of goals and assists as well on his tallies. So that is what I think about Reijnders. I think if a lot of people are considering someone who feels like a bit of a strong pick now, who can net you funds back, why not consider someone like that? I would still even say the same for Semenyo as well. If you let's say bought into a pick that has very, very dicey minutes for whatever reason, I can't think of someone who's 7.5 plus that you want to sell. If you own Gakpo, for example, does it make sense to really sell into Semenyo? Like, no. I think for most people's cases, you are going to roll if you've picked strong teams. If you have picked players like Malin, for example, this is a good opportunity to sell. Why wouldn't you? If you've picked some players who haven't started, are injured, for example, not that I can think of one on the top of my head. Tosin was the one who actually missed the match, for example, in Game Week 1, but I think he's going to come back for Game Week 2, so I'd probably keep someone like that. But that's the general logic, right? Most of the times we plan to roll. If you have issues, you can deal with them with 2 free transfers a little bit better. But this is also a time where I think the one almost player level insight that I can say I've taken away from Game Week 1 is Reijnders is just the real deal. He does look amazing, and I do think Pep is a bit of a form merchant. I have mentioned this a couple times when I do my shows and my cheat sheets. I don't often have City players extremely high on those cheat sheets, but this is a case where I feel totally comfortable with Reijnders being high up there. And you just have to say at the end of the day, this is a 5.5 player, and that's amazing. The next one is going to be that this sort of overreaction to draft structures, right? Where you're looking at the Salah versus Haaland draft structure, and also the Nomium captaincies flopping so far. Not only that, but also in that sort of tier of 8.5 to 9 million players, Bruno, Wirtz, Watkins, these players all blanked, and I think people have come off generally with maybe a bit more of a pessimistic expectation over some of these players. To touch on the Salah versus Haaland point, I still think it comes down to those opening fixtures for, let's say, Liverpool versus Man City. So as long as you think that Salah is going to produce some sort of level this year, what I will say is that the markets seemingly have been a little bit pessimistic on Salah. I think that his goal share has dropped a little bit, which also probably is reflective of maybe slightly higher assistive share. But when I look at the fixtures in the future, if you are on a Salah draft right now, give him at least up until Game Week 5. Game Weeks 4 and 5 are absolutely massive, and there's a big swing there for Game Week 5 versus the Haaland captaincy, especially, or just the Haaland pick in isolation, right? So unless you're on a Salah plus Haaland draft structure, this probably doesn't apply to you. You're already on your own draft structure. It actually looks really good right now. So congrats to you. You've got two high-performing assets who started the gate well. But when you look at, let's say, Haaland versus Salah, and you're looking at those independent structures, and you're thinking about how you're moving between these assets, I still think there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to overreact up until Game Week 6, right? Game Week 6 is probably the first window where I would say Haaland has a clear captaincy gain over Salah. Does he have a clear captaincy gain in Game Week 2 when he has Tottenham at home? I think so, to be honest. I think Haaland's a better captaincy this week, but there's absolutely no way that I would be moving away from Salah and overreacting to that, right? That's a -4 anyways, and I wouldn't do such a move, but you have to give Salah Game Weeks 4 and 5. That's my general take. Those are better fixtures than what Haaland has, and then you can reconsider at that point in time to make that move. As far as if you're on a nomium draft, is it worth overreacting here in this week, especially if you have Saka in Game Week 2? I don't think so. Would I probably captain Haaland over Saka? Controversially, I think maybe, right? I'm even almost thinking maybe this is a little bit overthinking too, but there's a possibility that you can say that Saka could even give a pity penalty to Gyökeres, and I'm not just reacting to the one performance, but that can happen, and has happened at times before, especially in comfortable games for Arsenal, where let's say they're already up a goal or two and suddenly you have an opportunity for a penalty. Does that reduce the ceiling of Saka potentially? Maybe. Clearly he does have the better game, but we're at a point now where I think I would say Haaland is potentially the better pick if you just think he's going to play that 90-minute match versus Spurs. If not, and if he plays, let's say, 73 minutes like he did versus Wolves when they had a really comfortable lead, that's probably a different story. But I tend to think that Haaland will play for most of the games as long as the game is in balance, and that's generally a positive thing. So yeah, I'm not too sold on moving away from Anomium. I think if you got Saka, you have the best, non-Haaland potential captaincy option, or someone equivalent, right? Super close in terms of the projections. I would also say it's a good opportunity to just let some picks that haven't done well so far do well, right? Watkins, Wirtz, Bruno, these types of picks. Unless you've gone into someone like Marmoush, for example, where I think it's very fair to question his minutes and move away from someone like Marmoush right now, who could even start, for example, but you just don't guarantee the minutes going forwards, I would still give those games out, right? If players like Semenyo are capable of getting a 50-minute haul, these players above those price points are more than capable of doing that too, and especially Dan Ballard, right? So if he can do what he can do, or did rather in Game Week 1, everything's possible. And a lot of the projections are still very healthy for these players. A lot of the picks that we've suggested so far have really been strong. I don't think there's a lot for Game Week 1 to react to. Just enjoy the fixtures as you go ahead. With Liverpool, for example, once again, it's one of those cases where either you sell them now in a really sort of harsh, reactive way, or you just keep them up until Game Week 5, which is a really good general run anyways. And then you can reconsider, right, on Game Week 6. Do you move to more City players, maybe even potentially some more Arsenal players at some point in time, like maybe a Game Week 7? So that's kind of how I feel about that whole tier of players and not overreacting to Salah versus Haaland. There's going to be a lot more battles to come. I would tend to be on that sort of Salah betting horse. I'm not saying that Haaland's wrong. I think a lot of people who've already gone for Haaland, they've got a huge advantage and they're a leg up, and congrats to them. So keep it up. As far as, let's say, the data recap of the week from an XG point of view, right? So this is almost looking at the match predictions that we had alluding to the games in Game Week 1, and then actually comparing to actually how these teams performed eventually in that Game Week 1. I think what are the sort of big overlying stories that I could say are quite interesting? I would say City, very impressive attacking performance. I'd say Tottenham and Liverpool still looking extremely healthy as teams. What's interesting is Liverpool, we probably already priced in as the best team. So they kind of delivered up to our expectations. And despite scoring 4 goals, they still racked up only 2.3 XG. I say only 2.3 XG. This is still the best team in the league, of course. And that's why I'm applying that sort of context there. But really, in terms of the teams that actually overperformed, I would say it's really more so City in this context here, who've done well from an attacking point of view. Otherwise, we also have Nottingham Forest doing very well, contrary to our expectations, a bit better as well. A lot of people, for example, were very down on Nottingham Forest attack in the preseason. I think part of it with Brentford is they didn't have two of their more key players, right? Sade wasn't on the field. Damsgaard wasn't there for the match because he had a newborn child. We also have Dango, who's expected to play more minutes in the future. He's probably a bit more of a pressing type that can kind of support this sort of Brentford team in a similar vein to how a lot of their previous forwards were also quite contributory towards the sort of defensive structure and scheme of the team. Now, what's a little bit more interesting as well is I think United, right? United is one of the probably biggest stories of the weekend, and I think they played really well. I'm also recording this video before Everton versus Leeds is being played. Maybe we can get really impressed by, let's say, Leeds' defense or maybe Everton's offense. Those are probably the interesting stories that before that game starts and gets played, I would be interested in sort of following up on where that ends up. But yeah, Arsenal were pretty dismaying from the offensive point of view, and they did concede a lot of chances as well versus United against our expectations. And I think that's for me the most interesting story. Bournemouth attack looked really good once again, if you want to give credit to them too. Semenyo was absolutely brilliant, and we don't even need to talk about the sort of incident, unfortunately, that happened in the ground, but I'm glad that action has been taken in that case. But it's just a positive, right? Looking at this Bournemouth team, they probably actually can bring in better quality attackers as the window comes towards a close, and that's a positive sign when you're looking at shopping players like Semenyo and Evan Nilsson from a Game Week 2 perspective, if you're going to be that aggressive. Otherwise, maybe from a defensive point of view, like what really shone out to me, I would still say Fulham actually looked quite impressive. You have to think about how they actually conceded a penalty. So with that penalty removed, generally they still kept Brighton to very minimal chances. And I think conversely, that's not a positive sign for Brighton necessarily, right? A lot of their players just didn't look very good. Io and Rutter, but I think Minte also had a pretty poor match himself. Made sense why there were so many early substitutions. I don't expect that to happen consistently. What's another team that didn't perform super well from the attacking point of view? Aston Villa. So Newcastle actually were really, really good. Had a lot of early performances and chances, especially attributed towards Elanga and Gordon, that I think they didn't really take care of. Aston Villa just didn't do anything and then eventually lost Konsa. But I think the key takeaway from that match is I don't think the red card changes the story of the tape. I think Villa were pretty much completely ineffectual before that red card, and that says a lot. Same thing with Chelsea as well, right? They were pretty good, I think, versus Crystal Palace in terms of the chances that they actually built up. I was actually pretty impressed by Estevao, and I think he actually could be quite interesting from an FPL point of view going forwards, because you're looking at a player who's actually at a reasonably cheap price, and we don't really have access towards that Chelsea offense at that sort of price point. So he's quite interesting to me. But Crystal Palace generally still performed reasonably well. I think when you look at, let's say, teams like Bournemouth and Crystal Palace, these are the players that we actually have seen consistently now perform with really good managers, and they played versus some of the toughest possible teams that they could have faced in Game Week 1. So going forwards, Crystal Palace and Bournemouth are still, in my opinion, that sort of long-term team to kind of target as we kind of look ahead. Otherwise, I think in terms of the promoted teams, I think Sunderland, of course, were very impressive. They actually did secure a very fine performance versus West Ham. Now, interestingly, I think there was a bit of overperformance there. And so I'm sure a lot of people will immediately kind of think about, why didn't you mention Sunderland first? They absolutely smashed West Ham. And yes, they did smash West Ham. But I think what was actually interesting is West Ham looked poor on the offensive end. And then there were individual mistakes, I think, that led them to conceding 3 goals on the defensive end, right? Sunderland's actual XG was far short of the 3 goals that they scored. They actually only racked up an XG of around 0.7 if you kind of want to round up. And West Ham only racked up 0.6 XG themselves. So actually, for me, the scary part here with West Ham is how bad is their offense really, and whether there's any takeaway points there. I think still you have to give sort of players like a Bowen and a Fulcrum more chances to play. Could be stylistic matchups that benefit them. Could be some tinkering from Potter in the future that can actually help improve the team, especially with the sort of quite lethargic midfield that they have. But these are the kind of takeaway points. And I do think from this game week on, it's actually worth just swiftly jumping into the predictions that we have for Game Week 2. So for Game Week 2, we actually have 11 of 5's match week predictions. What I would say for Game Week 2 is what's interesting. Man City definitely top in terms of the offensive numbers. Then we have Arsenal following closely behind. No surprise, this is Arsenal's best fixture in a long time here. I don't think one game that was poor versus United is going to change our mind about that. If you own Arsenal players, keep them for Game Week 2, then reassess if you really want to. With City, I would also like to touch on just the general topic about their predicted goals, right? Actually, when you look ahead, what's the narrative around Reijnders and generally their picks? I think a lot of people are just talking about the fixtures that they have individually, but actually only Game Week 5 is probably the scary one. I think generally, as we kind of came towards the preseason, the expectation was for City to take a massive step up. They've actually signed a lot of key attacking players. I think we continue to expect for them to perform really, really well in a lot of those games. And so when you look at Game Week 2, it's interesting to note that actually the pre-game week expectations for Game Week 2 were better than Game Week 1. So does that say a little bit more about Wolves, or does that say a little bit more about City? I'm not quite sure. I probably think I'd be a little bit optimistic about City and their overall performance levels as a team and what we can expect from them. And as I said previously, this is a great time to jump into Bournemouth and Crystal Palace. This is where their run starts to look a lot cleaner. Semenyo already did the business versus Liverpool, but you can only really expect more. Sure, there might be some tactical mishaps. I think that maybe don't help Semenyo so much, but he's just a really consistent, talismanic player for the team. I don't think there's any reason to sort of swerve yourself from that perspective, right? Trust the sort of numbers here and enjoy them. As far as Chelsea, it's still a very much clean run. With Liverpool, their offensive numbers are really positive. Although interesting to note that City generally just have a better run anyways from Game Week 2 onwards compared to, let's say, Liverpool for the next 6 matches. Otherwise, what else is interesting to call out? I think not too much from the offensive point of view, but we clearly have, from a Game Week 2 perspective, some pretty mixed bag or a pretty mixed bag in terms of the games. I think a lot of the matches, to be honest with you, are very sort of both teams to score looking like games. They're not any independent games outside of, let's say, Arsenal versus Leeds, where I would expect the clean sheet odds to be extremely high. So when we kind of shift over towards the clean sheet odds, Arsenal, no surprise, with above 50%. So that will be interesting to see whether that maybe changes in the future, especially after the Leeds performance, and what we can take away from that. Otherwise, though, it's Bournemouth and Crystal Palace, the teams that we've been talking about targeting, but Burnley as well, right? This is an opportunity for a lot of people who actually own Spurs defenders, in my opinion, to just simply bench them. Yes, Pedro Porro is a much better attacker than Maxime Esteve. I don't think I need to even explain that, but this is still an opportunity to go for a defensive player here who can actually benefit you more. Why is that the case? Someone like Porro could quite possibly concede more than 2 goals versus Man City. So you're already taking away clean sheet points expectations, but not only that, but you're adding negative points to it. Whereas with Burnley, the projections are still quite good, even though Sunderland looked as good as they did in Game Week 1. So this is an opportunity clearly to still play your Burnley defenders, your Crystal Palace defenders for the first time, probably, if you're rotating them, to continue playing your Chelsea defenders, to continue playing your City defenders, for example. And otherwise, I think it's an okay fixture for, let's say, Fulham. So, for example, the likes of people who own Anderson, or even, let's say, United picks, right? When we're talking about Adorgu, for example, I would actually consider playing an Anderson, playing Adorgu this week. Definitely, for example, maybe even over, let's say, a Spurs defender, as we mentioned, where they can actually get, close to, let's say, 0 points, negative points, that sort of thing. And that's pretty much it in terms of that sort of data preview segment. As far as captaincy this week, I did sort of touch on this at the beginning when we were kind of looking at that segment of discussing Salah versus Haaland versus some of the sort of sub-premium type picks. My order, and as controversial as that sounds, as I said, is going to be Haaland, with Saka extremely close behind. There might be a narrative take here, but I think when you actually look at the sort of projected odds, I think Haaland's actually looking really healthy right now as a captain. So yeah, maybe it's the case that clearly Saka has the best game, but maybe I'm emotionally swayed by Haaland's overall performance and maybe a little bit cool on Arsenal in Game Week 2, and maybe a little bit high on Leeds and their defense equally. But Saka is probably the most popular pick, and I think if you have Saka in your team, I'd probably go for him. But I think it's in that niche case of if you have Saka and Haaland, I might actually lean towards Haaland right now. Kind of hope that he continues that ball running. Last season, he kind of started the season as a bit of a wrecking train. I can't really see that not happening again. He's already gotten extremely hot. And then I'd probably say it's between Palmer and Salah. I think it's quite close. As we mentioned, actually, West Ham were probably more depressing, I think, from the attacking point of view than defense, even though the scoreline probably suggests the complete opposite. However, you can't say that Chelsea looked that impressive, and Palmer, once again, wasn't impressive. Now, Salah wasn't impressive either, but he still, within the dying embers of that game, still did what we want from Salah, right? That consistency is paramount. He is, in theory, still to be the better pick, almost on a long-term horizon. So the question, I suppose, at this point is, are you bought into, let's say, Ekitike in terms of the team playing more around Gakpo and Wirtz on the left-hand side, and that sort of shying, let's say, more opportunities, more chances, more production on the avenue of Salah right now from a goal-scoring point of view? I tend to think that they're very close. I am on Palmer and Salah. Right now, I'm actually leaning more towards Palmer. I think the market odds probably lean and back Palmer a bit more too, but I can totally understand someone seeing Palmer once again sort of playing that sort of left 10-ish type position, and being absolutely depressed with why they have Palmer in their team. So yeah, maybe that will sort of ring a little bit more true in my mind in a few days' time when I think about it a little bit more deeply. But I think that's a close 50-50. I don't think I would begrudge anyone for actually going for Palmer at this moment in time. You guys know that I went for a lot of Palmer captaincies last season for Salah, maybe for the wrong reasons, but yeah, I don't think it's a bad idea at this point in time. There is a gulf in terms of the quality of the game, but I can totally understand just going for Salah. You're not going to lose much out for it. But you know, if you, let's say for example, had Salah and Saka, if you had Salah and Haaland, it's so easy to just simply go towards a Saka and Haaland captaincy. I would take this chance very, very, very easily, in a similar way to how I'll probably take that chance with Bruno, for example, in Game Week 3. So that's kind of going to be the Game Week 2 preview. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful day ahead. Speak to you soon. Take care and goodbye. And let me know what your thoughts are in terms of whether you're making early transfers. What are your thoughts in terms of the team so far? And equally, what you're expecting in terms of, let's say, some assets that are probably still under the radar as I prepare for my cheat sheet series.